You know, when you think of empires, you probably think of gold or silk or spices, right? The things that nations go to war over. But what if I told you that one of the largest, most powerful private empires in history was built on something a lot stranger? This is the wild story of how a European obsession with beaver hats literally redrew the map of an entire continent. And for this deep dive, we're leaning on Stephen Bone's incredible book, The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire. It's an amazing look at this absolutely epic 200-year saga. So that brings us right to the central question, the one that sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud. How in the world did a fashion statement, a hat, lead to the creation of a private corporate empire that ruled a huge chunk of North America? All right, so to even begin to answer that, we have to start with the beaver itself. Let's really get into why this one animal became, for a while anyway, one of the most valuable commodities on the planet. Okay, so it all starts with the fur, obviously. Beaver pelts have this incredibly dense, barbed underfur that was just perfect for making waterproof felt. And that felt made for some seriously high-fashion hats, a total must-have for any well-to-do European. But the real surprise, the secret ingredient, was a substance called castoreum. It's a glandular secretion that was considered a miracle cure for, well, everything. Headaches, epilepsy, you name it. And get this, they were actually onto something. Castoreum contains salicylic acid, which is the main active ingredient in aspirin today. And this whole craze was fueled by, well, a mix of fact and some really, really weird fiction. For instance, there was this 12th century belief that when a beaver was being hunted, it would bite off its own testicles and throw them at the hunter to escape, thinking that's all they wanted. Now, that is completely wrong, anatomically speaking, but it just goes to show you how ridiculously valuable people thought these glands were. So when you have a commodity that valuable, you just know someone's going to try to corner the market. And that brings us to this incredibly audacious plan that was pitched directly to the King of England himself, a plan that would completely change the course of history. It all kicks off with these two renegade French fur traders, Radisson and Groseilliers. France wasn't interested in their grand vision, so they did the next best thing. They went to their rivals in England. And there, they managed to get the ear of Prince Rupert, the king's cousin. It worked. On May 2nd, 1670, King Charles II gave them a royal charter. And just like that, the Company of Adventurers, better known as the Hudson's Bay Company, was born. Now, you have to understand, this was not just some simple trading agreement. The charter gave these adventurers a total monopoly over every river and stream that flowed into Hudson Bay. That's a mind-bogglingly huge territory, which they named Rupert's Land after their royal patron. I mean, let that sink in for a second. 1.5 million square miles. An area of a continent the king had never seen, populated by people he'd never met, was just handed over to a private company? It was one of the most staggering acts of colonial ambition in history. Okay, so you've got this fancy royal charter, signed in a palace in London. That's one thing. But the reality on the ground, in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of North America, well, that was a whole different story. You see, the company had all these rules made by guides in London who'd never set foot there. For example, they had a strict no women rule in their forts. Yeah, right. That was immediately ignored as traders formed families and partnerships with Indigenous women in what were called country marriages. The rigid class system from England? It pretty much fell apart, replaced by a society built on practical skills and necessity. And those orders to grow European vegetables? Good luck with that. Survival depended entirely on Indigenous knowledge of the land, of hunting, of what you could actually eat. And this really shows you this wasn't just about business deals. People were building actual lives, actual families. This quote from a trader, Daniel Harmon, talking about his Indigenous family is so powerful. He asks how he could possibly leave his children behind. You can feel the deep bonds that were being formed. And it was these unions that gave rise to a whole new people, the Métis. So these trading posts, they became more than just forts. They were like the incubators for a brand new culture. They were these unique places where European commerce and Indigenous traditions came together, creating a society that was completely its own, and one that would go on to shape the future of the entire continent. So for more than 100 years, the company just kept growing and growing, pushing its influence further across the land. And at the absolute height of its power, the whole operation was basically personified by one man, A man who ruled this massive commercial empire with an absolute iron fist. And that man was George Simpson, aka the Little Emperor. As governor, starting in 1821, he was in charge of a territory bigger than all of Western Europe. And he ruled it with ruthless, almost superhuman efficiency. This guy was a micromanager's micromanager, with a relentless drive for control. Simpson was famous for being brutally, almost comically honest, especially in his private journal. I mean, just listen to what he wrote about one of his own senior officers. He calls him a very poor creature and says his work isn't even worth the food he and his family eat. Ouch. That gives you a pretty clear window into his personality, doesn't it? So how did he pull this off? How did one man control a continent? Well, his whole management style was basically built on two things: speed and surprise. He was constantly on the move, traveling thousands of kilometers a year by canoe, often setting speed records. He'd show up at these remote forts completely unannounced, keeping all his managers terrified and on their toes. It was his way of maintaining absolute top-to-bottom control over his enormous empire. But, nothing lasts forever, not even an empire built on hats. The world was changing, and the Hudson Bay Company was about to get hit by a wave of change it just couldn't control. So what happened? Well, a couple of things. First, the fashion for beaver hats started to fade. And at the same time, this huge, unstoppable wave of settlers started pushing west. The company had spent 200 years trying to discourage settlement to protect its fur monopoly, but now it was clear they couldn't hold back the tide of history any longer. Their time as a sort of private government was officially coming to a close. And this is so important to remember. This land wasn't empty. It was home to roughly 160,000 Indigenous and Métis people, whose entire world was about to be turned upside down by a business deal made thousands of miles away, by people who had absolutely no say in their future. And then came the moment it all changed. On July 15, 1870, the Hudson's Bay Company sold Rupert's Land to the brand new nation of Canada. It remains the largest single real estate transaction in history. A private company literally sold a continent. And in that moment, the modern map of Canada began to take shape. So the company's 200-year reign was officially over. But its legacy? You can still see its fingerprints all over the map today, in the borders, the cities, and the cultures that it helped create. It's a pretty powerful reminder that history is often driven by the most unexpected things. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? What is the true price of an empire that was, at its heart, all built on a fashion trend?